Damn, 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 Alexander Whitmore yelled, hitting the steering wheel of his $4,800,000 Bugatti Chiron Supersport. Blue smoke poured from the engine as the world's most expensive car became a dead weight in the middle of Manhattan's busiest street. The tech billionaire had exactly 45 minutes to get to the meeting that would decide the future of his empire. The Japanese investors wouldn't wait a second longer than planned, and canceling meant losing $300 million in funding. "Sir, may I help you?" a calm voice said from behind him. Alexander turned around abruptly and saw a black man in his 40s, dressed in worn clothes, unshaven, holding a plastic bag containing his belongings. His eyes, however, had something Alexander couldn't decipher: a penetrating intelligence that contrasted sharply with his neglected appearance. "Really?" Alexander gave a dry, cruel laugh. "And what exactly do you know about a W16 quad-turbo engine?" Thomas Johnson stood still, observing the smoke. "Based on the discoloration pattern and the frequency of thermal oscillations, I'd say it's an intercooler cooling system failure. The temperature sensor on Block 3 is probably sending incorrect data to the ECU." The smile vanished from Alexander's lips. These were not words a homeless man was supposed to know. "Listen," Alexander began, but Thomas gently interrupted him. "You have about 8 minutes before the engine goes into permanent thermal protection mode. After that, even Bugatti won't be able to repair the damage. Your car will become a very expensive $5 million sculpture." A small crowd began to form. People filmed with their cell phones, executives whispered, tourists pointed. Alexander felt a cold sweat of panic trickle down his back. His reputation, his company, everything depended on him arriving at that meeting on time. "I really can fix this," Thomas repeated, his voice maintaining its disconcerting calm. "But I need you to trust me." Alexander looked at the man in front of him, then at his watch, then at the smoke still escaping from the engine. 43 minutes. His mind calculated frantically. The tow truck would take an hour. The official mechanic was 2 hours away. An Uber in Manhattan traffic would be impossible. "You have 30 seconds to convince me," Alexander growled, "before I call security." Thomas nodded calmly, as if he had expected exactly that response. His eyes shone with a glimmer that Alexander couldn't identify. It wasn't the desperation of someone who needed to prove something, but the serene confidence of someone who already knew exactly how this story would end. "Mr. Whitmore," Thomas said, using the name that had never been mentioned, "I believe we already know each other. At least I know your work, and you should know mine." What Alexander couldn't imagine was that this seemingly desperate man hid secrets that would not only upset his day, but also his entire vision of intelligence, worth, and the people he had learned to dismiss with a mere contemptuous glance. If this story of humiliation and turnaround moves you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, because what you are about to discover about this beggar will completely change the way you see the people around you forever. Alexander observed Thomas with the calculating gaze of someone who had built an empire by evaluating people in seconds. "How do you know my name?" "I didn't tell you who I was." "It's written on the side of your car," Thomas simply replied, pointing to the small personalized plate that said, "A. Whitmore, CEO of Nexus Tech. And your photo was on the cover of Forbes 3 weeks ago, the young billionaire who revolutionized artificial intelligence." Alexander relaxed slightly, but his expression remained wary. "And I suppose you read the article at the public library?" "Actually, I read it on my tablet sitting at the Starbucks around the corner," Thomas calmly corrected. "In the same place where I read your shareholder communiques every Friday." This answer took Alexander by surprise. Homeless people didn't have tablets, nor did he subscribe to financial magazines or frequent Starbucks to read stock market articles. "Listen, I don't know what game you're playing here," Alexander said, his patience quickly running out. "But I have a meeting worth $300 million, and you're wasting my time with this comedy." "I," Thomas repeated, his voice maintaining that irritating calm. "Mr. Whitmore, your intercooler is overheating because the circulation pump in the secondary circuit is blocked. This is a known defect on the limited series of the Chiron Supersport. Bugatti published an internal technical bulletin about it last March. Alexander swallowed. This information was not public. Even his personal mechanic didn't know these specific technical details. "How on earth do you know about an internal Bugatti bulletin?" Alexander asked, his voice rising an octave. Thomas tilted his head slightly. "In the same way I know you canceled your premium insurance policy last month to save $50,000 a year, or that your company lost the contract with Samsung due to a 3-day delay in prototype delivery." Alexander paled. This information was confidential, known only to him and his financial director. "You're an industrial spy," Alexander concluded, his hand instinctively moving towards his cell phone. "You're recording our conversation. You work for the competition." Thomas let out a deep sigh, like a professor losing patience with a particularly slow student. "Mr. Whitmore, if I were a spy, do you think I'd be here on the street offering you my help to fix your car for free? Wouldn't it be more logical for me to just watch your engine melt down while filming the scene to blackmail you later?" The logic was undeniable, but Alexander was in total panic. His appointment was in 40 minutes. The crowd was growing, and this stranger knew intimate details of his life that even his own wife was unaware of. "Who are you?" Alexander asked, his voice now tinged with a mix of fear and morbid fascination. "My name is Thomas Johnson, a graduate in mechanical engineering from MIT, with a PhD in advanced thermal systems from Stanford. I worked for 5 years at NASA, where I developed cooling systems for spacecraft, 2 years at Bugatti as a technical consultant, and 3 years on the streets of Manhattan, where I learned that homeless intelligence is absolutely worthless." Alexander remained silent for a moment, assimilating the information. "MIT, Stanford, NASA," he repeated slowly. "If all that is true, how did you end up like this?" "Like what, Mr. Whitmore? Say the word. Black, poor, dirty, undesirable. Use the term that came to your mind when you saw me." Alexander looked away, uncomfortable with the accuracy of this observation. "I didn't mean—" "Of course you did." Thomas gently interrupted him. "And do you know what's most ironic about all this? 3 years ago, when I was still Dr. Thomas Johnson, a technical consultant, you sent me a personal invitation to speak at your annual innovation event. You offered me $50,000 for a 2-hour presentation on the future of thermal systems and technology." Alexander frowned, trying to remember. I send hundreds of invitations like that." "On April 15, 2021, Thomas continued relentlessly, "I was scheduled to speak right after you in the program, on the very day my life completely fell apart. 3 false accusations of plagiarism, a fraudulent investigation, and a justice system that decided a black man who was too successful must somehow be cheating." Alexander's discomfort was now palpable. He vaguely remembered the name of a speaker who had withdrawn at the last minute due to a personal emergency. The accusations were dropped 6 months later when they discovered I had been the victim of corporate sabotage. But you know how the tech world works, right? Scandals spread at the speed of light, while the truth crawls at the pace of a dying turtle. The smoke from Alexander's engine had slightly decreased, but the electronic diagnostic now displayed a countdown, 37 minutes before irreversible damage. "If you really are who you claim to be," Alexander began hesitantly, "then can you truly fix this?" "I can fix it in 15 minutes with the right tools, but first I want you to answer one question honestly. If I were still wearing my $3,000 suit and arrived here in a Tesla, would you hesitate for a single second to accept my help?" Alexander opened his mouth to lie, then closed it. The answer was clear on his embarrassed face. "That's what I thought," Thomas said, slowly nodding his head. "Well, Mr. Whitmore, today you're going to learn a valuable lesson about judging books by their cover. Because the same brilliant mind that designed the systems you use in your most advanced products is standing right in front of you, hidden beneath worn clothes and a few months without an expensive haircut." Alexander looked at his watch again. 35 minutes. His billion-dollar meeting was in 35 minutes, and his only hope of salvation lay in the hands of a man he had judged and dismissed in less than 10 seconds. "What do you want in return?" Alexander finally asked, capitulating. Thomas looked him straight in the eyes, and Alexander saw something there that made him shiver. It was neither greed, nor despair, nor even anger. It was something far more dangerous. It was the absolute calm of someone who had a long-standing plan and had finally found the perfect opportunity to execute it. "I want you to sit right there, on the sidewalk," Thomas said, pointing to the curb, "and watch a beggar save your millionaire empire. Then, when I'm finished, I want you to reflect on how many Thomas Johnsons you have rejected in your life simply because they didn't fit your limited definition of success." What Alexander couldn't imagine was that accepting this seemingly simple proposition would unleash a series of events that would not only save his meeting but completely transform his understanding of power, privilege, and the people who truly build the empires that men like him merely manage. Alexander found himself in a position he never would have imagined occupying. Sitting on the dirty sidewalk of Manhattan, watching a homeless man open the hood of his $4.8 million Bugatti. The irony of the situation did not escape passers-by, who stopped to film the scene with their cell phones. 32 minutes, Alexander whispered, obsessively checking his Rolex. The crowd had swelled to over 100 people, turning his personal emergency into a public spectacle. Thomas worked with precise economical movements, his hands navigating the complex engine as if it were a familiar map. "The diagnostic system is lying to you," he explained without looking up. "It indicates a general intercooler failure, but the real issue is micro-specific." "What do you mean?" Alexander asked, genuinely intrigued despite his anxiety. Bugatti engineers programmed the system to overdiagnose simple problems. This forces owners to use only authorized services that charge $50,000 for repairs that cost 5 cents. Thomas unplugged a specific cable, and immediately the engine alarm silenced. "There. Now we can tackle the real problem." Alexander watched, fascinated as Thomas removed components with the assurance of someone who had designed similar systems. "You really worked at NASA?" 5 years in the Mars exploration program. My cooling systems are flying in space right now." Thomas smiled slightly. "Of course, my name was removed from official credits after the incident." "What kind of incident completely destroys a career like yours?" Thomas paused his work and looked Alexander directly in the eyes. "The kind that happens when a black engineer questions safety decisions made by white executives. When you're right, but you don't have the social pedigree to be right." The answer struck Alexander like a punch. He remembered how many times he had dismissed suggestions from employees who didn't fit his company's cultural profile. "Specifically, I questioned the decision to accelerate the launch of a military satellite, ignoring my warnings about a thermal failure." Thomas continued working while speaking. 3 months later, $200 million exploded in the atmosphere exactly as I had predicted. But who do you think was held responsible? "You," Alexander replied, feeling a growing weight in his stomach. "Bingo, the arrogant young man who didn't respect hierarchy and created unnecessary problems." Thomas removed a tiny piece from the engine and examined it in the light. "Here's your villain, a faulty thermal sensor. Market value, 8 Authorized repair cost, $50,000. Alexander swallowed. "And how did you end up on the street?" "The investigation lasted 8 months. During that time, no company wanted to hire me with an ongoing federal investigation. My savings were depleted paying lawyers. My apartment was seized. After being completely cleared, I discovered something interesting about the American job market." Thomas began installing a replacement part he had taken from a small toolbox Alexander hadn't noticed before. "What I discovered is that acquittal is not justification, that your reputation travels faster than the truth, that when you lose your address, your phone number, and your bank account, even with an MIT doctorate, you become invisible to the corporate world." The crowd had organized into a respectful circle, many silently recording. Alexander noticed several people whispering, recognizing who he was, but their comments were not the usual compliments he received. 3 years on the street taught me things that 5 university degrees could never have taught me," Thomas continued, his hands working with surgical precision. They taught me to observe, to truly see people, to understand power systems from a perspective that executives like you will never have." "What perspective is that?" Alexander asked, now genuinely curious. Thomas paused and looked him directly in the eyes. "The perspective of someone on the outside, looking in. Do you know how many times in the last 3 years I've been within 10 meters of you?" Alexander frowned, perplexed. 17 times. "I was at the Starbucks where you hold your informal meetings. I sat on the park benches where you walk, talking on the phone with investors. I slept outside the dry cleaners where you drop off your expensive suits." Thomas smiled enigmatically. "You never saw me. Of course. People like me are part of the urban furniture for people like you." A shiver ran down Alexander's back. "You were watching me?" "I was observing the system. I was studying how real power operates in this city." Thomas reconnected the last cable and closed the access panel. "And I developed some interesting theories about the structural vulnerabilities of seemingly solid empires." Alexander looked at his watch again. 28 minutes. "The engine works. Start the car." Alexander obeyed, and the Bugatti purred perfectly without smoke or alarms. The crowd applauded spontaneously. "Impossible," Alexander whispered. "How did you fix something in 20 minutes that Bugatti said would take days?" "Because I understand complex systems better than those who built them." Thomas wiped his hands on a rag. "And because I have something they don't." "What?" Thomas leaned closer and spoke in a low voice, so only Alexander could hear him. "True motivation. They fix cars for money." "I just fixed your car for something far more valuable." Alexander felt another shiver run through him. "What is it?" "Access." Before Alexander could ask what that meant, Thomas walked towards the crowd and said loudly, "My friends, our friend here needs to get to a very important meeting. How about we let him through so he can leave?" People began to disperse, but many continued to film discreetly. Alexander realized that this entire situation had been filmed by dozens of cell phone cameras. "Thomas," Alexander called out, still perplexed. "What do you mean by access?" Thomas turned back with that enigmatic smile. "Mr. Whitmore, in the next 30 minutes, you will discover that fixing your car was the easiest part of my plan. The interesting part begins when you arrive at your meeting and realize that the Japanese investors have already seen the videos that are being published right now." Alexander checked his phone and found he had already received notifications from social media. Videos showing him sitting on the sidewalk while a homeless man repaired his luxury car were spreading. "You planned all this," Alexander realized, his voice mixing admiration and growing concern. "I planned it for 3 years, every detail, every variable." Thomas began to walk away. "Good luck with your meeting, Mr. Whitmore. Something tells me it will be even more interesting than you imagine." As Thomas disappeared into the Manhattan crowd, Alexander stood next to his perfectly functional Bugatti, slowly realizing that he had been a pawn in a much larger game he was only beginning to comprehend. The man he had judged as a desperate beggar had just demonstrated not only technical genius, but also a sophisticated strategy that was only beginning to unfold. Revenge, Alexander was about to discover, when executed by a truly brilliant mind, can be a work of art of devastating beauty. Alexander arrived at the Four Seasons Hotel 23 minutes late. His footsteps echoed on the polished marble as he ran toward the meeting room, still reeling from the surreal events of the past 2 hours. His Bugatti was working perfectly, but his mind was in utter chaos. "Mr. Whitmore," his personal assistant James said, rushing to meet him in the hallway. "The Japanese investors are, let's say, a little agitated." "Agitated how?" Alexander asked, adjusting his tie as he walked. "They've seen the videos, sir." Alexander stopped abruptly. "What videos?" James hesitated, then showed him his tablet. The screen displayed TikTok with a video that had already been viewed 3 million times. The title read, "Arrogant billionaire humiliated by homeless genius. You won't believe your eyes at the end." Alexander watched in silent horror as he treated Thomas with contempt, how he was corrected about his own car, and how he ended up sitting on the sidewalk like a shameful child, while the homeless man demonstrated superior technical knowledge. 2.3 million, Alexander murmured, incredulous. And it's rapidly increasing, James confirmed nervously. Twitter, Instagram, YouTube, it's on all platforms. Billionaire humiliation is trending. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face as he realized the extent of the disaster. His carefully constructed image as a visionary businessman was being demolished in real time by millions of people who now saw him as an arrogant, prejudiced elitist. Did the Japanese say anything specific? Mr. Yamamoto mentioned they were disappointed by the lack of humility and wisdom demonstrated in the videos. They said it didn't align with the values they sought in their business partners. Alexander pushed open the meeting room doors and immediately felt the coldness in the air. The 5 Japanese executives, who usually rose respectfully upon his entry, remained seated, their faces carefully neutral. "Mr. Yamamoto, I apologize for my delay," Alexander began, but he was interrupted by a polite yet firm gesture. "Mr. Whitmore," said the group leader in impeccable English, "we watched your videos this morning with great interest. Very informative." Alexander's discomfort intensified when he noticed that everyone present had discreetly taken out their phones, likely to follow the comments and shares of the viral videos. "It was a misunderstanding," Alexander tried to explain. "The man approached me, and you judged him by his appearance," another Japanese executive interrupted. "You dismissed his expertise without listening. You demonstrated precisely the kind of Western arrogance we strive to avoid in our partners." Alexander felt the ground open beneath him. $300 million in investment was slipping through his fingers because of a 40-minute encounter with a homeless man. "Let me explain," he began desperately. Yamamoto raised his hand again. "It's not necessary, Mr. Whitmore. Your true nature has been clearly revealed. We are canceling our participation in the investment. We will seek partners who demonstrate the values we respect." The ensuing silence was deafening. Alexander watched helplessly as the executives rose in unison and headed for the exit, leaving him alone in the room that should have been the scene of his greatest entrepreneurial triumph. James approached hesitantly. "Sir, there's something else." "Something else? What?" Alexander asked, his voice more like a whimper. "CNN wants an interview, and Forbes has canceled your cover story scheduled for next month. They said they wanted to reevaluate the angle of the story after today's events." Alexander collapsed into a chair, finally understanding the extent of the plan. This was no chance encounter. Every move had been calculated, every word carefully chosen to maximize his public humiliation. His phone rang. It was an unknown number. "Alexander," said Thomas's familiar, calm voice, "I imagine your meeting didn't exactly go as planned." "You planned everything," Alexander stated. "It wasn't a question. For 3 years, I studied your habits, your commute to work, your weaknesses. I knew that at some point I would have the perfect opportunity to show who you really are inside." Alexander looked around the empty room, realizing the magnitude of his defeat. "Why? I didn't even know you." Thomas laughed softly. "But I knew you, Alexander. I knew men exactly like you who build empires on the backs of people like me, then discard us when we are no longer useful. Today you learned that intelligence and human worth do not depend on a bank account or an address." "You framed me," Alexander whispered. "I simply filmed you as you are," Thomas corrected. "Your destruction is your own doing. Every contemptuous word, every condescending glance, every preconceived judgment was your choice." Alexander remained silent, knowing Thomas was right. "But here's the interesting part, Alexander," Thomas continued, his voice taking on an almost professorial tone. "This was only the first move. You haven't yet seen what I truly have prepared for men who think they can walk all over others and get away unscathed." The call ended, leaving Alexander alone with the sound of his own wildly beating heart and the growing realization that his public humiliation was just the appetizer to a feast of consequences he hadn't even begun to imagine. If Thomas Johnson had planned everything 3 years in advance, what else had he prepared for the man he had deemed unworthy of the slightest respect? 6 months later, Alexander Whitmore sat in the office he had once commanded like an emperor, now reduced to a shared space on the 22nd floor of an ordinary commercial building. Nexus Tech had gone bankrupt 3 months after the Bugatti incident, as the press had dubbed his viral humiliation. The videos had never stopped circulating. 42 million combined views had made Alexander the global symbol of corporate arrogance. Harvard Business School had created an entire case study on his downfall, titled, "When Prejudice Destroys Empires." "Mr. Whitmore," his new assistant said, "you have a call." Alexander answered reluctantly. It was his ex-wife who had filed for divorce shortly after investors massively abandoned his company. "I need you to sign the alimony papers. And Alexander, I saw the news about Thomas Johnson today." Alexander swallowed. "What news?" "He's been appointed chief engineer at Space Tech Industries, a salary of $2 million per year, plus profit sharing. CNN reported that he developed a revolutionary propulsion system that would reduce the cost of space travel by 70%. Alexander hung up and immediately searched for the news online. Thomas was there, impeccably dressed in a suit, being interviewed on the same show where Alexander had once been celebrated as a visionary. But the difference was stark. Thomas spoke with sincere humility about his intention to use his position to create opportunities for young engineers from disadvantaged communities. "My experience on the street taught me that genius has no address," Thomas said in the interview. "We are launching a scholarship program for low-income students and former homeless individuals interested in engineering, because wasted talent is a national tragedy." Alexander's phone rang again. It was James, his former assistant, who was now working for a thriving startup. "Alexander, I saw the interview. I thought you'd like to know that Thomas Johnson bought the land where he used to sleep on the street and is building a community center dedicated to technology. It will offer free courses and access to labs for anyone interested in learning." Alexander felt a familiar weight in his chest. While he had lost everything by judging a book by its cover, Thomas had transformed 3 years of suffering into a life's mission that would change thousands of destinies. "There's more," James continued. "He mentioned you in the interview. He said your experience with discrimination motivated him to create systems that identify talent solely based on skills, not appearance or origin. He thanked you for unintentionally giving him the final motivation to rebuild his career in an even more impactful way." Alexander hung up and looked out the window of his modest office. On the street, he saw people of all backgrounds walking, each carrying stories and potentials he would never bother to know. His phone vibrated, signaling a LinkedIn notification. Thomas Johnson had posted a photo of the community center's construction, accompanied by the following caption: "A year ago, I was invisible to the corporate world. Today, I use my visibility to make others visible. The best revenge is not to destroy those who harmed you, but to build something greater than they could ever have imagined." The post had received 50,000 likes in 2 hours. Alexander realized that his story had become a modern urban legend about the danger of prejudice, while Thomas had become a symbol of resilience and social transformation. One had lost everything by underestimating human intelligence based on appearances. The other had gained everything by demonstrating that true worth does not depend on expensive clothes or prestigious addresses. The final irony was clear. Alexander had tried to demean Thomas, but had only succeeded in demeaning himself. Thomas hadn't needed to destroy anyone to win. He had simply had to show the world who he truly was inside. Ultimately, the best revenge has always been extraordinary success. Dignity maintained under pressure and the ability to transform injustice into a driver of positive change. Thomas Johnson had proven that when you cannot change how others perceive you, you can completely change what they need to see. If this story of overcoming adversity and justice has touched you, subscribe to the channel and share your comments. Have you ever judged someone based on their appearance and regretted it later? Remember that the next person you underestimate might just be the one who changes your life forever.